So that's your overview of organic chemistry. So hopefully that all made sense. You'll go into all of that in a lot more detail next year, but I think it's really important for this year to have a good base and understand it well, because then it will make organic chemistry in 3-4 a lot more of a breeze to learn. So some tips for chemistry, just to finish off in the last 15-20 minutes that we have. First things first, it's important to study smart and revise regularly, and that will help you do well, hopefully. So what do I mean by study smart and revise regularly? It's not about studying all the time, every minute of your day, whenever you have free time. It's about being consistent and having a schedule and being very methodical and planned about what you're going to do. Why is this important? It's less stressful because if you constantly study and constantly are revising, you don't have to cram just before a SAC. And it's a little bit easier because your consistent studying means you don't study so hard at the end. Also, most concepts in 1-2 are linked and they help each other. So if you consistently revise and are consistently on top of things, then it really makes learning things in future much easier as well. So just before we move on, how do you implement this? There's lots of different ways that you can do it. Some ways that you can implement this consistent practice idea is basically just having an idea of just planning out what is coming up. So let's say you have a ChemSac that's coming up in 4 weeks. In the lead up to that 4 weeks, you might be like, okay, well, I know exactly what this SAC is going to be on because my teachers have told me. I'm going to split it up into 4 sections. And I'm going to study one of those sections for each of those weeks. And you might not have covered all of the content yet. So you start with the content that you've covered, revise that, and then move on. So if you kind of have that planned out a little bit better, it makes it a lot easier to do. Really important to practice questions rather than just memorizing content. Especially next year, if you find that you just memorize content and memorize how to do things, you'll find it difficult to do the more application style questions that VCA is really trying to do more of. So it's really about understanding the content and being able to apply it rather than just copy pasting definitions or copy pasting methods or calculations that you've already done. It also makes things a little bit more interesting, and it is sort of like active recall rather than passive. So you're really actively trying to recall information that you've learned, rephrase it in your own words, and try and apply it directly and make it relevant to the question. And it's really helpful because it helps you also kind of weed out some unnecessary and irrelevant things that sometimes get taught in schools or sometimes are present in textbooks. So it really helps you isolate the things that are the most important. When you're doing your practice questions, it's also super, super important to be proper with your practice. So don't get lazy with your calculator use. I know it's super tempting to just pick up a CAS instead of your scientific calculator because it has all this other functionality and it's so much easier to answer questions. But in reality, in your practice SAC, in your SACs, in your end of year exam, in your VCA exam next year, you're not going to be allowed to use a CAS. So make sure you use a properly authorized scientific calculator. That's super important because you'll get used to the shortcuts and the easy way of doing things and how to answer questions more quickly. And it'll save you time when you do your SACs and your exams. So get used to it and practice with it. Don't be sloppy with your short answers. So often it can be very tempting when you're answering questions just from your textbook or doing some practice to kind of shorthand your answers and not fully spell them out. And when you go back to mark them, you're like, oh yeah, that's what I meant, and you mark it correct. But in reality, your teacher, when you do it in a SAC, is not going to know what you meant or what you thought. Your examiner is not going to know what you meant or what you thought. They're going to know what's on the paper. So take it seriously and really use the time to properly practice how you would answer your question in full without any shortcuts, without any shorthand. It might take a little bit longer, but it's good practice to get into. Also, don't skimp out on sig figs. I think this really is the year to understand sig figs and get good at it, because sig figs are tricky and they're a little bit overwhelming when you haven't seen them before. And it's really helpful if you can get really good at it, and it kind of becomes second nature just to check it and make sure your answers always have the correct significant figures. And if you put that practice in from this year, when you go to do it next year, it'll just be second nature, and you won't have to think about, oh, do I have the correct number of sig figs? Do I need to go through it again? What was that rule again? It just is really, really helpful. Cool. So I think that's really the main things with proper practice. The other thing is, I know you don't use the data booklet a whole ton in 1-2, but also get familiar with looking at it from now. Be familiar with what equations are in there. Be familiar with your periodic table. Again, not all of the things that are in there are relevant for 1-2, but some of them are, and often in your SACs and your end of year exams, you do get to use the data booklet. So find the stuff that's relevant and get used to using it from this year. I just sort of mentioned this before. It's important to take 1-2 seriously, but not too seriously. So it is a good practice for the real deal, and really it's all about learning. It's not about getting 100% on all of your SACs and end of year exams and acing everything. It's more about learning what your study strategies are. Are those study strategies working, or are they being really time consuming and not actually giving you the results that you want? And it takes time to learn chemistry. It is a difficult subject. It's a little bit different to other science subjects as well. So get used to how you want to study. It's not a bludge just because it doesn't count to your final ATAR. I know some people definitely treat it as that, but you know, it is a prereq for a reason. There's not a lot of 1-2s that are prereqs for 3-4, like bio, for example, isn't. And really there's a reason for that, because a lot of the things, and a lot of what we covered today actually, thinking about things like mole, thinking about your intermolecular bonding, organic chemistry, all of that comes up again next year. So if you want to make next year as smooth as possible, not have to relearn things, understand things better, take this year seriously and really understand it. And honestly, it's more so the skills that you acquire rather than all of the memorized content that will count towards your 3-4 study score. So the skills in terms of mole, the skills in terms of knowing your sig figs, the skills in terms of knowing how to answer short answer questions, knowing how to do calculations and also show your working for your calculations, knowing how to answer more like 4 or 5 mark questions that are a bit more open-ended. All of those skills, if you start developing them now, it'll make your life so much easier next year. And of course, it's all of this is about how much time and energy you put in. 1-2 and even 3-4, it's not just a prereq. If you really put a lot of effort and time into it, it can be super helpful for the rest of your life. And honestly, there's so many things that are super applicable in terms of chemistry. So I'm doing medicine at the moment, and it's actually shocking how many times chem comes up. Like even the simplest thing like calculations, like concentration calculations, that comes up in med, because sometimes you have to calculate doses of medications. You need to know percentage composition and things like that. That comes up all the time. Organic chemistry comes up all the time because a lot of medications are based off organic chemistry. So it's really, really relevant. It comes up quite a bit. So try and put as much into it as you can, try and be as engaged as you can, and you'll get a lot out of it. I'm just going to finish off. I don't have a distinct slide for this, but just about some general tips that I used in terms of for chemistry and also just VCE in general. So some general tips for studying chemistry. I'm just going to go back to this slide here. So often another question that gets asked along the lines of practicing questions versus memorizing content, not really memorizing content, but more so, do I take notes or do I answer questions? My personal approach for this is to make notes, but your making notes should not be copy pasting or, writing down exactly what's on the slides. It should be an active process where you're really actively trying to understand the content and put it in your own words. So my personal way of writing notes that I would highly recommend for any content heavy subjects, so things like bio and psych, this might also be helpful for, is I just take an A4 piece of paper, fold it in half or draw a line in half, and then I would have one dot point on each side of an A4 sheet of paper, so an A5 sheet of paper really. And you pick a dot point from your study design, and everything that's covered in that dot point needs to fit in that A5 sheet of paper. So what that allows you to do is you're really actively trying to think, okay, what content have I learnt that's relevant for this dot point? And also, how can I summarize it in a succinct way that all of it fits into this half an A4 sheet of paper? Because you can very easily fill up pages and pages of a workbook just by copying information from slides or textbooks or whatever else. And it's so easy to fill up an entire half sheet of paper. Almost 4 or 5 sheets of paper just on one dot point. But when you go back to revise it, it's a little bit harder for you to understand what is the relevant information, what's like extra stuff that was in the textbook, what do I actually need to know? So this is a good revision tool, not just because you're actively thinking and learning when you do it, so you're using your brain a lot more when you're actually putting pen to paper, so that's super helpful because you'll remember things a lot better than just copying and being a little bit more, not using your brain as much. The other reason this is super useful is when it comes to revision for your SACs or revision for your end of year exam, you'll just have a bunch of sheets of paper that you can use as your exam prep, rather than looking through whole pages of notes. So you might end up with, I don't know, maybe like 20 or 30 sheets of paper all up. I used to double side mine, but you definitely don't have to do that. And you have your entire 1-2 course in just those few sheets of paper. So it makes revising a whole lot easier. So my personal thing was that's how I wrote my notes. I found that very useful, and it's a much more efficient way of making notes, in my opinion. And then once I wrote my notes, or depending on how much time I had, I would simultaneously be doing practice questions. I preferred to do sort of VCAS style questions. In 1-2, I know that's a little bit difficult, but you can use things like topic tests that we have at ATAR Notes, or you can also use your textbook questions and do those while or after you've done your summaries. And the reason that's helpful is it might jog your memory for some things that you've missed on your dot points. And you'll also be simultaneously applying that knowledge, so it really helps reinforce that together. So yeah, that's a method that I always mention because I think it was super helpful, and it's in my opinion, a great way of taking notes. And this year's definitely the year to experiment, so you can try that method out, see if you like it. If you like it, by all means keep going with it. If you don't, you can try something else, and that's the beauty of this year because it doesn't count. You can try different things and perfect your study strategy for next year. Cool. The other thing that I wanted to talk about in terms of VCE is I often get asked, how many hours did you study a night? Do you have to study all the time to get a high ATAR, etc.? So this is where the consistent practice, not religious study bit, really comes in. So the two methods that I found really helpful in terms of this is calendar blocking and Pomodoro. You may or may not have heard of either of these things. So calendar blocking is basically just a method where you take either a physical or an online calendar. I like online calendar because you can move things around, so I use Google Calendar. And you basically just put in what you're going to do with your day. So first you put in all of your non-negotiables, your school times, obviously, meal times, work, sport, extracurricular things that you have going on, things that you have to be at. You put all of those in first, and then in between, you schedule in your study. So let's say, let's just go through like an average day. Let's say school starts at 8 a.m. So you wake up by 7, get ready, leave the house by 7:30, get to school at 8. School goes from 8 to 3. And then you have basketball practice after school from 3 to 4:30. And then so you get home by 5. You might want to have a bit of a snack, have a shower. So at 5:30, you're ready to sit down and study. So maybe you give yourself like a 2-hour block or a 1-hour block, however many you want. So let's say 2-hour block for study, 5:30 to 7:30, and then have dinner till from 7:30 to 8:30. And then you might give yourself another hour of study from 8 to 9, and then relax for about an hour, go to sleep, do it all over again. So doesn't have to be exactly like that. Obviously, your schedules are going to be different, but that's an idea. So the reason I found this super helpful is because sometimes you get home from school and you're like, I should study, but I don't want to study. So I'm going to shower, I'm going to eat, I'm going to watch YouTube, I'm going to procrastinate, blah, 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 blah. And it's harder to focus and get into what you're doing. Whereas if you have this method, you're like, okay, I have to be studying from 5:30 to 7:30. So it's scheduled, I have to do it. So it forces you to sit down and do it in that time. The other benefit of this is making sure that you don't just schedule study in all of your spare breaks. Schedule yourself time for other things, like scheduling yourself time for your extracurriculars, scheduling yourself time to relax and do nothing as well. That's also really helpful because I don't know about you, but especially when you have something like a SAC coming up, anytime you're resting or not doing anything or procrastinating, you're not really relaxing. You're just like, oh, I should be studying, I should be doing something. And this allows you to be like, okay, well, I already scheduled my 3 hours or 2 hours of study for today. I've already done that, so now I can relax for the rest of the night. It just makes things a little bit easier on yourself. The other thing to use that in combination with is Pomodoro. This you might have heard of. I think it's a little bit more popular. It's basically a timer where you give yourself either 25 minutes or 50 minutes to work. Some people use other times. And then you take either a 5-minute break if it's 25 minutes or 10-minute break if it's 50 minutes. You can experiment and find which one works for you. For me, 50 minutes works better because it takes me a little bit to just get started. And I find with 25, I get started and then it's break time already. So I prefer 50, but you can figure out what works for you. And the reason why that's really helpful is, again, your brain doesn't want to be like, oh, I need to study, and you're constantly thinking about, I need to study and not really doing it. You can be like, okay, I have this next 50 minutes, I need to study, and not just I need to study, give yourself specific goals. So let's say you have that 2-hour time period, 5:30 to 7:30, I'm going to be like, okay, I can do 2 Pomodoro sessions in this time. In my first Pomodoro session, I want to write my notes for let's say 3 dot points of Chem 1-2. So you should have a concrete goal and that time to do it, And having a concrete goal and a set amount of time actually makes you work more efficiently and faster. So that's a super helpful thing if you find yourself procrastinating a lot. So give yourself a specific goal and a specific time. So this is kind of like the SMART goal thing, which is a little bit, but it does help. So that's some general advice on how to approach studying. You can use that calendar blocking Pomodoro method for any of your subjects, but obviously just adjust as needed, as it works for your schedule, as it works for your study and things like that. But I think that's a super, super helpful thing to do. And especially if you have a lot of things going on, like I know a lot of people work and do extracurriculars and go to school, it really helps you find the time to relax and also find the time that you need to study as well. So highly recommend both of those things. And YouTube is also super good resource to find some more information and details about those things as well. Cool. So that's it for me, guys. I hope you found this useful, a good overview of most of Unit 1, and then a little bit about how to approach chemistry for the rest of the year and hopefully next year as well, and a bit about how best to study for VCE. So I hope this year goes really well for you guys, and you keep enjoying chemistry, and I hope everything goes well for the rest of your studies. So thanks everyone. Bye.